Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Lee Montville. I'm the Director of Special Sales and Business Development at Springer Publishing. For those of you who don't know Springer Publishing, we are an award-winning publisher of nursing and healthcare content featuring books, apps, journals, and digital products. Today, we are presenting Comparing and Contrasting Teaching the Group Counseling Course Online versus in Person, with the authors of the recently published Introduction to Group Counseling text, Sam Steen, Rachel Vanada, and Kara Aiva. Now for a little bit about our speakers today. Sam Steen is an associate professor, licensed professional school counselor, and director of the Diversity Research and Action Consortium, who specializes in school counseling, group work, and cultivating Black students' academic identity development. Rachel Vanada has been in the counselor education field since 2010. Presently, Rachel is a senior training specialist at the Institute for Innovation and Implementation at the University of Maryland, Baltimore, where she engages in workforce development to support socio-emotional learning and to promote positive mental health outcomes in children and families. Kara Aiva holds many identities. In addition to being a wife, mom, school counseling advocate, and co-conspirator in working to dismantle oppressive educational practices, policies, and systems, she is an associate professor in the Counseling and Education Settings program at Rowan University. Before we get started, I want to mention that this webinar is being recorded. If you miss any portion of this presentation, you can find the video on Springer Publishing's website 5 to 7 business days post-event. If you have any questions during the webinar, please type them into the Q&A box on your Zoom control panel. I'll bring them up at the end of the presentation. And if you forget to ask a question, there will be a brief survey sent at the end of the webinar, and you can include your question there. Now, without further ado, we will turn the time over to Sam, Rachel, and Kara.
Good afternoon. I have the pleasure of beginning this conversation. The title used to include Author Reflections of Teaching in Person versus virtual. So it's clear, I want to be clear that some of what will unfold today is a conversation between myself, my good colleague Rachel, and my good dear colleague Kara as well. And so I don't want to confuse you, but that's sort of intentional. It kind of aligns with the way we've engaged in this work. It also aligns in some way about how we feel about groups and the importance of being fully present in the here and now, and also experiencing or sharing what's going on for us, at that time. So just want to give you a heads up. So we'll start with our positionality and reflections around teaching the course. We'll try to highlight this really important piece of research that we came across when putting together the research, the presentation, because it was so relevant. And perhaps the author is actually here in the audience, potentially, because they do a lot of good work in group counseling. And the name, I don't want to butcher it too much, but the first name is Yin Ying and the family name is Song or Si Song, something to that extent. We'll also talk about a few ideas for maximizing the teaching modality as things are changing. And last, we hope to provide enough time for you all to ask questions or to respond to the work or to even engage in a critical discourse, because it helps further the learning for us and hopefully for you as well. So Kara, we'll start with sharing a little bit about herself.
Hi, everyone. I am a cisgender female who's been married to a woman for over 25 years, who also has 2 children, which I personally think that's probably my full-time job. In general, I am a professor here at Rowan, and group is a passion of mine. 2 things just to highlight: as someone who was always on teams and sports and activities, and I don't think I actually realized how group really informed who I am in multiple spaces. And so I tell people that my first PhD class was advanced group counseling, and I was able to recall this memory of being in group counseling as very few people back then were divorced, had families who were divorced, and that's what it was for. And it was my school counselor in middle school. So I can remember the room and all those things, but I didn't know it until that moment. And then similarly, as you know, I grew up and went into counseling programs and I've ran so many groups for adolescent age. I should let everybody know this. I'm a proponent that a lot can get done for people, both socially and emotionally through a group counseling process.
Thanks, Kara.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rachel Vanada, and I identify as a white cisgender heterosexual female. I am a wife and a mother of 2 young children. Like Kara, I've been involved in groups, I feel like throughout my whole life. Sports have been a really important part of my life, and I participated in a lot of extracurricular activities and things like that growing up. And I had never really, thought about the role that I take on in groups or kind of how I engage as a member of a group. And to be really transparent, as a master's student, when I, was required to take the group counseling class, I absolutely did not want to be there. I didn't, probably like many master students, I feel like I didn't understand what groups were. I had a really sort of limited conceptualization of what it meant to be a group leader. And through that experience, and especially through the experience of participating in the training group as a member, I was profoundly impacted by what I learned about myself, and just seeing the process and dynamics unfold in real life. It's one thing to read about it; it's quite another to experience it. And so, since then, really, so much of the work that I have done in counseling and counselor ed has been around group work. And I'm so thankful that's how I got to know Sam and Kara, and that has been, such a blessing as well.
Thanks. It is exciting to be here as well. And I guess I can start in the context of the conversation of how important my positionality is, or our positionality is, and how we show up as group leaders. So we're modeling or confirming for you the importance of engaging in conversations like this. So here written there, African American, cisgender male, but I identify as Black. So I see myself, racially as Black, but ethnically speaking as African American. It took me a while to come to terms with that, because I always felt like, I hadn't been to Africa, not trying to be flippant, but really true. So I didn't get why we were called African American. Always was raised like, I went to a Black church, or, I like to eat soul food, and that's things related to Black folks. But as I became more knowledgeable about the terminology, ethnically speaking, I identify as African American. There's some things that are really salient to me in that regard. And I feel very confident and comfortable in my skin as a person who identifies as Black and, ethnically speaking, African American. As far as like the group piece of it, or I can say cisgendered male and those things, but as far as like the group piece of it, my family has always been extremely important to me, meaning like my immediate family as a kid, my extended family. My father was in the military, so we traveled a bit, and we would always go back to Memphis, Tennessee to see our family around the Christmas time. And I would get teased because I sounded so different than my cousins did, but it was important for me. And I realized as I became a master's student that I was practicing my either group leadership skills or therapeutic skills with my family, parents in particular, when they would be arguing. They argued quite a bit. And I was a middle child, so I wanted to keep the peace anyway. And I remember sitting on a dining room table, like on the countertop, listening to them argue in the 8th grade, and was saying, "Mom, what dad is trying to say to you is X, Y, and Z. Pause a minute, and then, Dad, what mom is trying to say to you is X, Y, and Z." And didn't know that that was a counseling skill at the time, or this ability to really speak to those things. And so as a master's student, I assumed that one day I would be a counselor for Black families. That was important to me. By trade, I became a school counselor because I had an opportunity to work more closely with children and adolescents, and thought families would be there, parents would be there involved. And then I got a chance to like teach a group class and learn under a mentor who was really involved in groups. And I realized like, wow, this thing really fits very naturally. Also a former athlete, I could see the dynamics at play, in meetings that might not be focused or centrally targeting the group process or looking at the group dynamics, I can really see them very clearly. And so teaching seemed to be a more natural progression in that regard. And to Rachel's point, I've never really had a problem with being a group leader or seeing the benefit of that. But as a professor, I noticed that a lot of students did feel the way Rachel was referring to, where a little hesitant, or why are we doing this? It's not that important, or this is easy peasy. And then on the flip side, after going through the process and sort of embracing and trusting this great opportunity, really saying like, wow, this is much better than I realized. And I'm actually gonna see if I can learn more about it or take advantage of this in my practicum or internship. So in sum, all three of us sort of speak to our positionality. And in my mind, they're fluid, right? So today, this is how I'm feeling about it. More heavily salient on the family piece. We just had another young child and things of that nature. And the extension of like extended family coming to visit. So I see what's going on, a blended family in which I'm a part of as well. But we know that this is central and important as we try to lead others to actually engage in that work, whether it's in person or online. It could potentially be a little bit more difficult virtually, but that's neither here nor there. So as we shift into another objective, which would be to highlight this relevant piece of research that recently came out. Here you see the professor or the author there. And it was so compelling because the timeliness of this work was really quite helpful. It's not just talking about the virtual nature of it in the midst of, the pandemic, if you will, reflecting back some of the work we've been doing and where we are today, but also this idea of trying to do it well, because we know that telehealth and telemental health and things of that nature have been here for a while, but now we've all been thrust in to have to really do it. Might we build on what is already out there to do this well? And so the two pieces of the puzzle that we want to highlight are these facilitating factors and these hindering factors, right? So I invite Rachel and Kara and I to kind of jump right in there. I'll start with the professional attribute, and the research says some pieces around that, but when I see professional attribute, I might think about like, how comfortable do I feel in that way? Or what's my experience actually doing this? Or, professional, how was I trained, right? So I'll just stop there and say one more piece. I was trained at the College of William & Mary as a master's student. No offense to the guy, I can't remember his name, but he came in, said, you're in group. He put a little bell on the table and then he left. And for 8 weeks, we figured it out. So that was my training. Now, how do I take that and now one day be a group therapist and teaching others? I've come a long way. So I'll just stop with that. As you all see this slide, what comes up for you? I guess we can start with the facilitating factors, right? And then we can move to the hindering factors. That might be a little more organized.
I've never heard you tell that story.
I'm embarrassed to share it.
So when I look at that list, I think about one that stands out to me with regard to personal traits is a trait of flexibility and adaptability, in being able to sort of think about the way that we do things differently. When we were all making this shift to teaching online, I, was reading all of the things about what you're supposed to do, because I have if we talk about, professional attributes or training, I didn't have any training in teaching online. So I was trying to figure it out. And one of the things that I read was, don't just take what you used to do and try and put it online. And that was like precisely what I tried to do, because I didn't know how else to do it. And I think that I struggled with some of that flexibility. And I think that people who, I guess all of that to say, I think that personal trait of flexibility and openness to thinking about things differently and sort of trying things differently, and maybe too openness to things like flopping, it may not work. You might try something and it may not work, and that's okay. And gosh, that's also so true for when we're actually leading groups. You might try something and it might flop, and that's okay. Our classes recover from that. Our groups recover from that. That's okay.
I think, Rachel, just to build on that there's a huge part of this too that is developmental in nature, right? And so in the world of counselor ed, we have a lot of people who are really good with meeting students' needs just in general, I'll say emotionally, right? However, I feel like the teaching of this really does have a level of pedagogy that not all counselor educators might have, right? If you're in school by nature, like this is something you have to adjust to, but even then, it's not necessarily easy as well. And I think tailoring the experience, to your point, Rachel, of not just having, right, not just putting what we do. I think one of the things and challenges in being developmental, and this ties into getting acceptance from students of the online format, is one of the things that you learn online that I feel like I did is that what the opportunity to be in with each other to discuss becomes very critical, right? Like you get rid of fluff in some ways that they can read on their own, that right now in this moment we need to hit some highlighted things, whereas if we were in the class, we're like, no, we need to get through all of these things, blah, blah, blah. And then they can go to group essentially in some ways. And so I do think uh, prioritizing maybe is even in that same skill set of being able to deliver that from a developmental perspective and then
Yeah,
gain their trust, right?
right, that we know what we're doing. So the facilitating factors include like, hey, are we trained or prepared to do this? Are we flexible in that and creative? Rachel, you're saying, how do we help students adjust to, okay, we know we're doing, we're trying to shift here. Can we hear from you, but also adjust to what's going on and meet your needs? Get rid of the fluff. We don't have a lot of time to waste because you can't sit on your I have a hard time sitting on my laptop or on Zoom for 3 hours, and classes are sometimes 3 hours in brick and mortar, but you get up, you walk around, you move, and you do these different things. So there's some of that, but these facilitating factors of like the resources as well. Think about resources. So is it the faculty member who's at an institution that does or does not have those resources, so when they're available and they're supportive and things go wrong, you can quickly get somebody to help you? Imagine if you don't. Imagine if you're in a region where, okay, some of your students can easily get online because of the support and the resources there, and others can't. The bandwidth, few people are at home, somebody's streaming a song, so that could hinder, even though we're talking about facilitating factors. So in the research, they're confirming some of the things that we've experienced, how we have to be flexible in that time, whereas in this endeavor, whereas when we were in person, it just didn't come up. And so as we're shifting now to like some of the hindering factors, this is where it's like the verdict is still out. This professor, author and team was able to come up with some things that they had experienced, and some of it relates to the work that we're doing. I'll start with the first one again, the COVID pandemic and the social unrest, the issues that were going on. So I've been teaching group for a long time, and Rachel said I never shared that story because I've tried to move on from that. And I can say something like, the guy who did it was a white male, older white male. He had probably been doing his thing for a long time at a very reputable institution. He was very well respected, and it probably worked, right? Because there's some flexibility. Cake prep wasn't on the map of like, sort of scrutinizing, is he meeting the standards or the objectives? But as a person who identifies as a Black male, right, I can't come to class and just say, here's a bell, now you all go and do your thing. I'm going to get crucified in my reviews. From my experience, I have to kind of be on point. The hindering factor for me in this case about the COVID pandemic, it was like, oh my gosh, front and center, I'm having my own difficulties with this stuff that's going on. We were in brick and mortar, had the timeout, didn't want the semester to end, so we regrouped and came back and started meeting virtually. Had to go through that transition for everybody. What do you talk about? There's so many different things. And then, do I acknowledge my Blackness more intentionally? Do I shy away from it because now people are even more scared to have these conversations? I grew a lot in that way, but there was a lot of barriers and things that I was struggling with at that time. And I feel like those were hindering factors. It really made things more anxiety provoking. And I think the disconnect, because now I'm shifting from just that 2020 to 2020 spring, fall semester, 2021 spring semester, right? So it kept going. This pandemic is still around. I'm still in the skin, but I don't get to meet the kids the first day of class, students, the first day of class and say hello and get to know them. They see me on a camera. And then, what is this going to be like when this guy who has all this experience in group work, and now he's challenging us to, deal with our own stuff. And primarily a lot of my students were, white women in a lot of cases because I work in a predominantly white institution. And it was just very tough for me. So those were hindering factors, in person and virtual, that I think it was more difficult because the season which we were living in, and this author here confirmed that that's what they were experiencing as well.
Mm-hmm.
Anything you all want to react to as you see because there's a number of things to talk about.
I think one of the reasons I'm having a hard time reacting in this moment, Sam, is that I feel like I am, I'm this realist optimist. And so I see pluses, right? It didn't mean that it didn't come without challenges, right? And we're going to talk about, I think on the next slide, probably the largest one that I faced in regard to ethical issues. But I think one of the things that we had going for us is that we teach multiple programs, group counseling, so school psych, school counseling, and higher ed folks. And it is a requirement for all three programs. And so there's always a mix in there. And because I have been in this place for 13 years and people have talked about how our group experience goes, which is different than most, they've all talked through the time period. And so they didn't care that it was online, right? They actually were really coming for the group experience. And so there wasn't a whole lot that I personally had to do to try and get them to engage, if that makes sense. But to your point, Sam, one of the things I learned really early on in delivering this was to set them up. And so all 3 semesters, I would have a full 2.5 hour group session that I led with them, really centered around healing centered engagement. And so I modeled for them how to talk about race with each other, how to talk about oppression, right? And so I think that experience online, which allowed them to be home and be safe, right, while participating, then allowed them to transition into what would be the experiential group process. But there was a lot of upfront work in that piece to get them there.
What's going on for you, Rachel? Because I have a reaction to CARES, but I'm wondering anything else around the hindering pieces or anything like that.
Well, go ahead. And
you sure? Yeah, you sure?
Yeah.
Because I don't want to, sort of hog the.
No,
the
you're good.
Welcome to our meetings.
Yeah. So no, Kara, I appreciate that. You're suggesting. So then it goes back to the hindering factors. It's all unique based on our own individual positionalities, intersections of identities, the respect students might have, the relationship you have built up over the year, your reputation, right? And I'm suggesting that when I hear you say that, you did a great job. And when I look at these things here, I'm like, so this hindering factor of lack of related experience, do my students look at me and say, oh, this guy knows what he's talking about, even if they see the Vita?
Right.
And then so when I'm challenging a white student, I'm just going to say that to hey, be comfortable having this conversation about race. Do they get right in there, or they're like, wait a minute, why are you pushing me that way? Whereas maybe you can do that a little bit. Now, I'm not saying you don't do that just with white folks or folks who identify as, sort of, in certain ways. But I'm saying that these were hindering factors that were very real for me. Like a technical concern is not the best one, because that's kind of like the resource piece, but the camera situation, I had to it was hindering in my mind. If you're in person, right, and somebody is in group and they do this, you think something's wrong, right? So they don't do that. If you've ever been a group leader and somebody gets up and leaves in the middle of the session, you're like, wait, everybody's gonna see where you're going. Right. But in this case, the hindering factor was what do we do with that? Do we need to go back and negotiate? Because it was kind of the rules of engagement for me came after the fact. They weren't okay, we're moving to online. These are the things we need to do. Those ground rules every semester, they change based on some of the experience that was going on at the time. So my reaction to what you were saying was wow, what a luxury that you didn't really have that many hindering factors, and you were kind of forward thinking and actively engaging in schools and doing some work around that you were saying that you could apply to the master's students. But I didn't have that luxury. I had my own challenges, and then also the difficulty getting people to really trust the process now, because the excuse was no, there's no way we can do this online. It can't be. I'm sorry, I didn't take it during, in person. I didn't sign up for a master's program for an online program. It was brick and mortar. But I'm like, just work with us. Let's make it work for you all. And I'm not saying we're out of the woods yet, but we're a little bit closer than we ever were. Sorry, Rachel, what were you thinking?
No, that's all right. I was thinking about that part with regards to engagement and
rules of engagement. I think we should have listed that. I love
the rules of engagement and just I think finding a balance. So I think regardless, of when you're teaching online, if we think back to the time when the pandemic just started, like there are some specific things related to that. But then also just generally, if you're teaching online at any time, I think there are some general kind of pieces about the engagement that feel challenging to me. Like I think that it can be difficult to get to know, it's one thing to know people first. And then I think, Sam, you didn't say this maybe super specifically, but we're kind of alluding to that sense of like kind of credibility or like, do the students sort of think you know what you're doing? I was a newer faculty member when that happened. And so hadn't always had other experiences with the students who were in my class. And then to your point, you've seen, lots of students come in and they don't really want to be in that class when they first start. Hopefully that changes over time. But so then when it feels like I'm not sure if I have a lot of credibility, and I just feel more comfortable. Like I feel more comfortable meeting people in a classroom. I feel very comfortable there. I feel very comfortable in a classroom. When I look at a screen with maybe a bunch of this on the screen, in terms of
you start wondering.
It really leaves me wondering. And so, so I feel like that's something that, and then, kind of looking specifically at the time that the pandemic was happening and thinking about engagement, the balance between, I really want students to have a good experience with this. And also there's a lot of stuff going on in the world right now that, it's like both, like, let's use this time to kind of support and maybe process some of that. And also I understand that your mind is elsewhere. Like there are some really serious things happening outside of this group. And I feel like for me, trying to find that balance in terms of like having appropriate expectations for engagement and kind of, understanding and empathy for where we were in the world with also, yes, and let's use this experience. I felt like that was key.
Just to point out to our audience right now, because I'm going to have a here and now kind of moment, and this is very similar to our process, the three of us. We talk a lot about power and privilege and intersectionality and how that plays out. And Sam, it's one of those things that becomes a professional attribute in some way, right? That we're up against. And I think we should name it, it's not necessarily there, but, the privilege of being a white professor, although they still believe that I'm Hispanic in nature from an assumption standpoint, right, does give me a different level of ease in some ways to navigate and challenge. And I feel like we don't talk about that enough in group in general. We always talk about the process. But people come in, right, with their own things that are happening in the world and how they believe. And we like to utilize group, right, to address some of those things. But I just want to be here and name it because it's not even listed here.
Yeah, thanks for saying that. I know that's how you think and what you feel. And so even though it's not a hindering factor, this is something that I did to overcome some of that lack of credibility, assumption about credibility and things of that nature. Is one, not be resistant about it, and to also use it as a parallel process. So as a group leader who's doing a good job in person or online, if we're pushing students, challenging them, or encouraging them to dig a little deeper, there's going to be some pushback. That's a good sign. That means if every member you work with loves you, you're not probably doing enough work with them, right? Let's be real, because we're the first target. And then the other piece of the puzzle, is to your point, Rachel, is like, hey, how do I let them know that I'm humbled in this experience with you because I don't have the answers. And might we co-create it differently? Like in person, we don't have that problem because when you're walking back to the parking deck with a peer, you're making cohesion, you're connecting, and that's fine. When we take a break and you're in the hallway talking about shopping for your child's birthday party, it's fine. But in this virtual space, we didn't have that. So might I become a little more flexible to overcome some of these hindering factors of folks, we don't want to be here. Let's really make it about your space and what you need in this moment as we all try to figure this out. Right. So
Yeah.
so yeah, I hear you. That's where I think the connection is made, is like not to be resistant about it and to model for them how to move forward. So Carrie, you
Mhm.
alluded to like
Yeah.
one particular piece of this ethical aspect, right? And so we
Yeah.
know in person it's different than it is in on virtual spaces. So go ahead, jump right in.
Yeah, it is extremely difficult. And I have explained to Rachel and Sam before that I've always looked at it from a K-12 lens, because at that point, right, we were supervising school counselors, running groups, and having to flip the script. And, it's another layer of working with minors. And so one of the things that we settled on in most schools and in informed consent regarding confidentiality was having to have the students wear headphones.
Mm,
um and they personally could have people that they want near them in some ways and can hear what they're saying. That's on them, but they're still addressing other people, right? So the confidentiality piece of not hearing what somebody else said was one thing that we can address, but we can't address when someone's talking and they're talking directly to a person with other people being there. And then how does that ultimately impact the others, right? Because if you're in flow in some ways, right, people tune out what's happening all around, but it doesn't change the fact that confidentiality is the forefront of why group works, or at least one of them. We say it every group, we remind people, right? And yet we as facilitators can't control it. And so we're going to try and co-construct and create what that looks like, and talk about the difficulties that could be and what could ultimately support you in willing to engage in this process, right? But it's still something that in an in-person environment we can control, and we can't control it in the same way online.
what about your experiences, Rachel?
Yeah, I think that this was maybe another place where sort of my approach, perhaps when we first transitioned, would be different than my approach now, where,
Mm,
when we first made that switch, everyone was at home, people had
mm,
roommates, kids, no childcare, pets,
mhm,
the whole 9 yards. There was everything that you could imagine in the background. And that was how it was. And I think that again, it was like a balance between trying to find some level of confidentiality, so like wearing headphones, right, but also just the reality that everyone is at home, and there's setting a different expectation or a different requirement would probably be unreasonable. As things have changed, I think in thinking about what confidentiality looks like now, there might be able to be some more kind of structure around that is reasonable to expect, because there can be people out and about, a little bit more, or but it also, I say that and also recognize that, there have been a lot of financial impacts. And so maybe there are still a lot of people living in a home, or childcare right now is very difficult to find, and it's very
mhm.
difficult. And I mean, it's very expensive. And so, expecting someone to always have childcare in the evening so that they can fully participate that's hard. I mean, because that's what I would want, right? And if they were in a class, you wouldn't have them bring their child into class. That wouldn't be something that would typically be okay. Um, but also, you know, I don't know, we have to kind of meet where we are and be reasonable for where we are. So I think, to Kira's point, I mean, headphones, really trying to be in a room by yourself,
Mhm.
and being really transparent. If you're, for example, if it's teaching a class and it being the training group, talking about what people's concerns are related to
Mhm.
confidentiality, and really kind of
Mhm.
getting those out on the table in a way that is transparent and not acting like they don't exist, or acting
Mhm.
like people shouldn't be or aren't concerned about it.
Yeah, that I hear you on that one. I'm gonna try to talk through distractions because distractions could apply across the board, not just in the context of ethical issues or confidentiality, but they're linked, right? So if confidentiality and everybody agreeing that what we say in here stays in here will improve the cohesion and other therapeutic factors that might emerge, I feel like I can trust the process and really actively engage. Then it seems to me distractions take away from that, because if I'm distracted, am I really fully invested? Distracted, even if it's by default. And if I'm not fully invested, am I going to give of myself? And if I don't truly give into the space, it's easy for me to say, oh, guess what such and such said, or take a screenshot of what's going on, or to text a buddy over here. Did you hear what she just said? Because I know that sometimes happens in class, right? In class, they might look at each other and give the eye. That's a little different. But we don't know the extent of the group chat or things that are going on, not necessarily Zoom or WebEx, but it could be cell phone, right, etc. Those are huge. Or are you really Googling or searching for a gift for a friend while you're in class? Yeah, sorry, Dr. Steen, I really am. So there are a number of distractions that I feel like we could kind of speak through that in person, they didn't exist. And then to the point of like, hey, let's be realistic and know we all have these things. If I have a child who's in the hospital, yes, I'm in group. I might excuse myself and go out in the hallway if I'm in person. But if I'm here, might I just turn my camera off and sort of check the cell phone? Fine. But how do I actively engage and continue that? What if somebody was really in a moment and I do that? How does it actually impact the process? So not really having an answer for all of that, but recognizing that, yeah, these distinct differences, they're still at play.
Sam, it made me think of this second bullet here that, we've talked about this as a group, that I think the chat feature was the greatest thing that ever happened to us in the small group. And part of it is because of the generation of who they are. Part of it is probably confidentiality, but it kept the group talking more. And I think the absence of silence, right, in some ways come in that regard, because everyone's reading something, so they think that time is being filled. But I would say by default, the chat, I would actually argue, built the most cohesion if they were being present. But it was a default originally, I think, for confidentiality, and we didn't know enough to create it as part of the norm. It became the norm that they were all comfortable with because they had been doing it in other classes. And I would also argue that as a professor too, right? Zoom could be very quiet for yourself when like you pose a question, right? But when the chat thing happens and they're also reading it, right? And so in some ways they're imagining the person also saying it. And I feel like it does create more of a connection that does in some way offset some of the other barriers.
I grew in that area in a lot of ways. One was following the lead of the students, but also it would almost be like a compromise of, I noticed there's some commentary in the chat, and I haven't heard from you, Sarah. Might you either read or so further elaborate what you put in the chat? And some of it was because I was trying to fully be present with what's going on in the space, the Brady Bunch captions, if you will, and not reading the chat myself. So I would draw the member in to do that. But initially it was like, no, don't do the chat because I don't want you chatting. Like I removed the chat where you could just chat with one person. But if you put a comment in there, it would have to go to everybody. Right. And so I hear you saying, hey, the chat would allow a greater connection. And I did see that actually being more encouraging. It's like we all are different learners. Some of it's generational. Some of it is fear of. Some of it is like, I don't want to unmute myself. And you were about to, that awkwardness we hadn't talked about explicitly, but we know that that's there. And the chat keeps things moving forward in a way that we hadn't really seen personally. So if Rachel, if you're okay, I'll go to the next one and see what we have. So you can start with this one. So challenges for group leaders. Some of it was from the literature, but also some of it is sort of the way we're thinking through our own experiences as we reflect here with you in this moment. What about you, Rachel? Anything stand out as we move on to this one here?
I feel like we did talk about all of this, and I'm just going to be Rachel for right now's role and just give us a time crunch on where we are.
Well, no, but Rachel, I mean, we have time. Yeah, we have time because we were going to leave questions, but the challenges might be folks out there might be experiencing some. So if it
True.
were repetitive, but also can add some other things. Rachel, if you're ready to go ahead, because I have one as I think about it.
Yeah, I did have something that I just wanted to mention, and some of this came up through our conversation yesterday. Kara and Sam was just about, and I think that this is kind of related to the lack of clarity regarding nonverbal cues, but some of the muting and unmuting and camera on and camera off, and the importance of, when we talk about setting norms and like wanting to have facilitative norms in our groups, a lot of times when we're in person, those norms can be facilitated by the leader in an implicit way. But there are some norms, I think, that occur in a virtual group that need to be more explicitly stated. I feel like that was something that and that's, I would say, sort of just in terms of thinking about my own personality, like I'm not into that. I want it to feel different than that, but I think to attend to things like confidentiality, to, attend to things like the engagement, where it's like, Sam, you were giving the example of if someone were to just get up and go out of the room, like that would be something, that, and how are we sort of dealing with or understanding if someone turns their camera off for a minute, things like that. Like, I feel like some of those things, it's just important to be more explicit in an online group. And so if that's not, like, it wasn't for me, if that's not sort of part of how you lean in terms of your personality, or if it's not something that you think about, I think you can find yourself in a spot, because we know it doesn't take very long for norms to develop, where some kind of unhelpful norms have developed in your online space that just you hadn't necessarily like thought about to be explicit about. So that's what I wanted to say about that.
I'm just taking note, the rules of engagement for virtual group, right? We're just going to add that in a later point in time. I'm just making note for that right now, because you're right.
Exactly.
The explicit piece, well, we didn't, and even prepping for this, we didn't even think about what those things are, but we now have an idea of what the explicit language, I feel like, needs to be to avoid some of what you are referring to as far as difficulties.
It's a work in progress. And as I think about maybe who signed up or who came to have this conversation with us, or at least listen through some of this, are folks who are likely teaching the course, right? It's not going to be master students who are like, hey, I want to learn more about group, but they're probably folks likely teaching the course. If you were in a counselor education program that taught you how to be a group facilitator directly, and you had a class advanced group and you were supervised and things of that nature, consider yourself very lucky. But to this day, I'm not aware of a book or a textbook that teaches doctoral students how to teach the group course. There was a chapter that Rex Stockton wrote, may he rest in peace, that was really seminal for me, but that was it. And there were a book that did that. Okay, so think through. A few years ago, I'm learning how to be a group facilitator and or to teach group class. One day I'm teaching group class. At the time, though, I was in a brick and mortar, learning how to run a group and developing a way to teach group. And then over the years, teaching group in brick and mortar. Okay. So a challenge now for a group leader would be, okay, telehealth, we're virtual. Am I teaching my students how to run a group online, or am I teaching them how to run a group in person? I'm teaching them using a virtual space, but I want them to learn how to do this in person. But it's like you have to do both, because there's difficulties in managing online settings. You now have like screen sharing, PowerPoint, these other Google Docs that you can create, or other creative things of using music and all these other things that in person, you can do that, art therapy and hands-on engagement, but how do you translate that to the virtual space? So all I'm thinking about out loud is a challenge for me was thinking through how to prepare school counselors and clinical mental health therapists using an online Zoom, WebEx platform to run groups virtually and also in brick and mortar. And I'm not out of the woods yet. Because to your point, Rachel, it's like the way I've been doing things didn't just apply automatically. And then now how do I get them to be open to like, well, what are we doing? Are we learning how to run we're practicing facilitating groups virtually, but then some of them are going to go into a school setting and actually do it in person.
So Sam, I'm going to ask you this question. Are you an empath?
Empath means what? Am I empathetic? I don't know what
No,
that
meaning
means.
like you can be in the moment with a group of 8 people and kind of feel what's going on.
It's a little easier in person, but I've learned how to watch how distracted has that person been to really know if I can sort of sense that. So maybe.
Because I feel like as people who really spent a lot of time, right, in person and then learning it in person, right, and then trying to recreate, to your point, right, teach people virtually to be able to do it in both. I would say one of the hardest parts is, when everyone's on mute, right? Like, just to be clear, you lose this ability, I think, in some ways that a lot of counselors have to be able to feel the
Sense what's going
environment and
on.
sense what's
Yeah,
going on.
yeah,
And I've realized now how that looks different for me in a Zoom format, but it's still, and it's actually in some ways more of a boundary of letting
Mhm,
all of this kind of in. But I do consider that part a huge challenge that is definitely a continuous improvement piece,
mhm.
is the sensing piece.
Yeah, thanks. I've learned something today, and so I'll still kind of haggle what that means for me, but it's helpful to think about how to do it and how to develop more cues or senses or strategies to get a sense of how actively engaged people are, and then maybe to model that for others. Like when you're doing this work virtually, here's some things to pay attention to get a
Right.
sense. Rachel, anything from this one, please? Yeah.
Well, I was just going to add, to the part about trying to and I think it goes both ways. We can be in an online classroom trying to teach students how to lead online and in person, or we can be in an in-person classroom trying to teach them to lead in person or online, because I think the reality is that all of it is going to continue to exist.
Exactly.
And
And has existed.
has existed.
Pandemic.
Yeah. And I guess it just gives me maybe an opportunity that I will always take to say, we need more group education. We need more opportunity for group facilitation. It is hard enough to try to prepare students in one semester to
One
do it
class.
one way. Yeah, one class, one way, to try to think about all of these different nuances. And I realize it's not totally different. It's not totally different to do it online versus in person, or to learn in person versus online. It's not totally different, but there are differences. And I've certainly had students who have talked about, like, whoa, it feels different when you're sitting in a room with 9 people. That feels like a lot, and
Yeah,
it
for
does.
sure. Mhm.
Or, I've been sitting here looking at a screen where I can very easily see all 9 faces. Now that I'm sitting in a circle, like, I really intentionally have to,
Have
you
to
were talking
look.
about scanning. I didn't know what you were
Mhm,
talking about scanning until we
mhm.
sat down in this room. So I just say all that to say, like, there's a lot of nuance, and it's a lot to prepare students for, I think.
We wanna
And then
make sure. Go
I was
ahead.
just going to say that I was just going to add to that, and then layer this aspect that we really look at, Sam and I, in schools, right, of utilizing that to address inequities and racial tension and things of that, and affinity groups, right? Like, that's a higher level skill that also requires not just the facilitation skills, but kind of a connection to mindset too, right? And critical consciousness. So to your point, Rachel, the nuance piece is way beyond, right? It starts with being able to deliver and to understand those differences too, but one class isn't gonna cut it.
Now I'm mindful of the time. There's about 10 minutes left. We wanna leave time for Q&A. I'm not sure if questions have been populated
Mhm.
in there, and but hopefully. And so there's maybe 2, 3 slides left. We've talked through some of this, but engaging students. One, I'm gonna steal from you, Kara, because in person, I would try to create, you could call them pair shares, where they turn and talk to a person, or I've done this where, like, have snacks at the beginning. We don't share snacks anymore, but right, COVID, but have snacks there. Class is starting, come in, take a snack. You don't have to eat it if you feel uncomfortable, put it in your bag, and just talk about whatever, right? Building that time. With Zoom, you kind of sit down and you just jump right in. But Kara, you shared something before that I didn't realize, that there was confirmation at work. So now, hey, class is about to start, but might we break out into pairs and do some work and then come back? We won't have time to talk about everything that all the pairs talked about, but you can use breakout rooms very easily in a group space to give them that opportunity to take a break, breather, and relax. And then again, you shared this one again, I'm taking from you, is like, hey, what about we meet and then you divide them into half? So 8 go into a breakout room, and now it's a little more intimate and closed and a little bit more comfortable because there are less people they have to contend with versus, I don't know how many people are typically in your class, but maybe 16 like they are in my class. So engaging students in the virtual space versus in the person, it's different. And we must continue to go back to these facilitating factors of being creative and thoughtful and allowing students to come up with ways to help you do that.
And Sam, if you actually are, that's a great segue into the next slide, really, of sharing. So one of the things in this book that we did was create a podcast. And so we're just going to give you a couple of examples. They were a group who were interviewed together, but I think it's helpful from a student perspective, right, to kind of either validate or to help us give feedback from a continuous improvement standpoint. And they're the first to tell you that it was very, they went in with the expectation of the group process of having to take the group, and they really were unsure of how it would work. And I think to your point, Rachel, too, like we're really unsure. So it would be very confident. I would announce it differently now, right? And set up norms differently than we did back then. And just to be clear, I did facilitate this class that we're talking about. But I think it's important because, they can't believe it worked, right? Because it's one thing about group that people don't believe in the process, right? And then you add the virtual component, and then they can't believe it happened in that. And then the social awkwardness, Rachel kind of talked about this earlier. It was one of those things that, again, we wouldn't have not known to set up as norms. So groups kind of figured that out together on their own, and it got less awkward as time went on. But to Rachel's point, that is something that I would explicitly now write when we talk about rules of engagement I think about the math on my syllabus moving forward. And then we know this from the research about mental health counseling in general. When people are able to be in their own space and safe, and they are like attentive, it is easier to be vulnerable. And so my students talk about the Zoom room being a room. It was just them in the room. And that to them was limited distractions in a safe space that allowed them to be able to share. And so I've shared this with Rachel and Sam, but the journals that happened during this whole experience were the strongest and the most cohesive I have ever seen as far as group members. And I really believe what Ashley shares here is a part of that process.
So we have one more slide, I believe, and then we'll get to the questions. So teaching ideas, right there, we've invited some of those. Rachel, anything you want to add as an idea that comes to you off the cuff as we're bringing closure today?
I don't think so. I think that top one, maybe the top two would be things that I, just because of my personality and my style, those would be those that I think probably really emphasize.
It makes me want to write it in a chart for the next time around. Like, here's what maybe setting up norms in person looks like versus, virtually.
Yeah, I was sitting here thinking teaching ideas when we're in this virtual space. I mean, we use a lot of case illustrations and things like that, right? Reflections, but really more so is this I'm going to just go for it. So this idea that when you're on Zoom, you also see yourself. When I'm in a room, you don't have to,
you can change it though.
I mean, okay, fair, but I'm saying I'm not that skilled in the technology, right? I don't do that. I'm old school. So it's just, right? There are other ways you can massage or mess with the settings, but I'm going with this sort of idea of this teaching idea, like when we make this transition, when we're in Zoom, we see ourselves or you see everybody at the same time, right? So it's this highlighted sense of who I am and how I'm showing up that is a little different in person, It's so I feel students are hypersensitive, hyper aware. I feel like I am at times like, oh, I get now why I'm saying a question and my eyebrows are frowning up, but my children do the same thing. And I'm like, well, it's just the way it is. Doesn't mean I'm confused or upset. That's just what happens. But when I'm in a room, I don't see it, but I see it now. And so this thing of intersectionality and all that is like, might we become more comfortable with just really sharing our true selves in a place and just go for it and model and teach others to do that as we come to terms with the new season in which we're living in. I'm going to say new in terms of COVID and the racial unrest and all those things, but also the beauty of technology, and then also the challenges associated with it, and just being real authentic and genuine and honest about that. So the teaching idea would be like, take it, own it, and instead of avoiding it, like go through the process with them in a real direct way. And sometimes it's scary, but I think that we have to lead and model for them some of that, and hopefully others will follow.
Sam, I'm so grateful you shared that, because I think one of the things that we forget as instructors in that realm, especially when it's virtual, you're right, you're on. And so there's this constant level of almost of criticizing yourself in a way, or we would hope that it's reflective. But I would say I reflect in in-person teaching, and specifically group, like I would drive home, I'd think about it, I'd be done, right? But Zoom, you're right, it makes me actually probably reflect a lot longer and a lot deeper, because you're trying to scan back, and you can scan back because it was so intense in the first place. So I appreciate you sharing that as we move forward. But Sam, I'm also going to read this question to you.
You have a question?
There's a question in the chat.
Oh, that's good. At least one.
Yeah. Yeah.
Read it, and I won't joke
Sure.
anymore.
So, hi, my name's Patricia. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a new counselor, educator, and groups course steward. I really like that terminology. We are teaching groups in a seated classroom in a fully asynchronous online classroom. What are your thoughts about inclusion of a recorded group leadership assignment for the online students? They would be expected to participate as members and leaders. The student lead group activity is vetted by faculty and personally growth related.
So I'm going to tell you what I hear the question, and then you all can help me answer it. So the question is like, it's a blended model. Some folks are in the seats, and I heard the term asynchronous, and some are only reacting virtually or in an asynchronous format. A means like they're not in that room.
They're not. It is a true online class. Yes.
But there are some people in the class, right, in the seats. If you read the first part of that.
Patricia is saying no, none present ever in class.
Okay. So no one ever sees them in person, but might they go out, record a session, and come back and we evaluate it to see? Is that the question?
Yes, but she's also saying it. You know how a lot of people in group classes have students take turns facilitating icebreakers to demonstrate group leadership skills?
Yeah.
She's saying, how do we feel about them doing that and recording? Right, Patricia?
Separate class for seated students. So I think there are two classes going on.
Okay. That's why I was confused. Yeah. So the asynchronous one needs an assignment. And what do we think about that? Right.
Yes, and that's what she said. I clarified with her. That's what she said that assignment was. I mean, I'm just gonna off the cuff say like there are programs that do that, who have them do these icebreaker activities to get them to practice, to have some level of facilitation. And I'm gonna admit I don't do it because I don't necessarily like the fact that they get caught up in just icebreakers. But at the same time, if it was your students, there's this level of cohesion that gets built as a result. But when you're in asynchronous land, right, who are they facilitating this with? And if it's going to happen, I guess my question is that to really think this through, what are the parameters of the people that have to be in there? Like shouldn't be family and it shouldn't be friends, right? Like there's an ethical piece to that. And I guess icebreakers are an easier way to do that in some ways because from a counseling, ethical permission form kind of way. Oh, it is with their classmates.
With their classmates.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh,
so they will record each other. They will record a session that they're facilitating with their peers.
Would they all have access to watch them? Because see, to me, that would be an equitable learning experience if you watched all of them and also had to compare and contrast them.
I think that if you watch them, it would be brilliant. It would be kind of tricky because let's say someone, I'm a neighbor, not a family member, and you say, hey, can your child or adult son be in the session? Sure. But those informed consents and all that is a little messy. Like we're gonna show it with master students. How do you keep track of that? But if you're an online program, you probably have some of those technological and online supports to deal with that type of thing. So I would go for it. So my direct answer would be like, that's brilliant. Might you mitigate some of the issues because it's asynchronous, and I always say we're asynchronous, and so it's gonna happen Anyway, so yeah, I'm not the person to put up red flags. It's not like, can you, but how do we go about doing that? I would say very thoughtful, making sure that when we are observing others, it's more of a critique of the skill development versus some other pieces of the puzzle. Might you have some consistency in what they target so that you have compare and contrast versus like, okay, you're doing anger management, you're doing support, but then that might be boring, right? So I don't know. I'm kind of like,
So it made me think, Patricia, to share with you how we do this in person, because I feel like you can do this asynchronously. So, like I said, I have a blend of people who all work in K-12. So, just like all group classes, they have to develop a curriculum. And I have a group of 6 to 7 work on a group curriculum on a topic that they want. And each person is a facilitator of the lesson that is part of the overall group curriculum. So somebody does the first session, second, and third. And what happens in that process is that the person who's a leader writes a self-evaluation, and the person who's a member writes a journal about the group experience, and then also gives feedback to the leader. And the leader gets at the end of the course anonymously. So they get feedback on facilitation skills. They're still a member, but they can also record this process, right? So that you can see it over time. And so that way it's connected to the group curriculum and there's cohesion around instead of doing all these other activities, I guess I'm saying.
So it's some consistency in the work. Are there other questions? Have we run out of time? How do we, I'm
yeah.
relying on Lee and the folks.
Thank you, Sam, Rachel, and Kara. Actually, all the questions have been answered. So, and thank you all for doing this. If you can just switch to the next slide, we have information about buying their new book, which is available on our website at springerpub.com. And we are offering a special webinar discount, 25% off if you use the discount webinar. And we want to thank everyone for attending today, especially to our presenters for hosting the webinar with us. It was a pleasure to have you all. And I want to reiterate that the recorded session will be available on springerpub.com in 5 to 7 days. And we hope to see you at future Springer webinars. Thank you again, Sam, Rachel, and Kara, and everybody in the audience. Stay well. Goodbye and have a great day.
Thank you.
That was fun.